Imagine living in a world where every day is a battle, where there is no escape, and where the only way to move forward is to endure it. All are in silence. At the center of this story is Chen Nian, a brilliant student whose only goal is to pass the university entrance exam and leave her environment behind. However, the difficult situation of a classmate makes her the new target of a group of ruthless bullies. Cornered and with no one to turn to, her life changes when she meets Xiao Bei, a young delinquent who, despite his tough appearance, becomes her only protection. The story begins in a classroom where Chen Nian, now a young teacher, is giving an English lesson to her students. With a calm voice, she emphasizes the importance of the language in their lives, but her gaze stops on a student who seems restless, lost in her thoughts. Something in the girl's expression feels familiar to her, like an echo of her own past. Unable to help it, her mind begins to drift into memories, taking her back to a time marked by fear, loneliness, and a person who left an indelible mark on her life. Years ago, Chen Nian was a high school student known for her intelligence and dedication. Her life revolved around studying, with a single goal in mind: to pass the Gaokao, the demanding university entrance exam that would determine her future. The pressure was not only on her but on all her classmates, creating an atmosphere of constant tension at school. However, academic competition was not the only challenge she had to face. To isolate herself from distractions and focus on her preparation, Chen Nian often took refuge in music, using headphones to separate herself from the noise of the outside world. But one day, that invisible barrier suddenly breaks when a commotion interrupts the classroom routine. Uneasy murmurs spread through the room, and when she turns around, she sees her classmates running towards the balcony. The confusion on their faces is palpable, and an inexplicable unease takes hold of her. Guided by the collective agitation, she makes her way through the crowd until she reaches the edge of the corridor. What she sees next takes her breath away. On the ground in the courtyard, surrounded by a circle of curious students, lies her best friend, Xiao Di, the young girl who until that moment had shared with her worries and dreams. Now she is motionless, her fragile body reflecting the brutality of the fall. Horror settles in her chest as she comprehends what has happened. But what paralyzes her is not just the loss of Xiao Di, but the reaction of those around her. Instead of helping, the students take out their phones and start taking pictures, spreading images on social media without a shred of consideration. Morbid murmurs fill the air, whispered comments that reduce the tragedy to a mere passing spectacle. The indifference is overwhelming. Trembling, Chen Nian makes her way through the crowd and, without hesitation, bends down to cover her friend's body with her jacket. A silent gesture of respect in a sea of empty stares. Everyone knows the truth. Everyone has seen what Xiao Di suffered day after day. The school advisor was the invisible executioner who pushed her into the abyss. However, no one dares to speak, to point out the culprits, to break the cycle of violence. Fear is stronger than justice. The next day, Chen Nian is called to the principal's office. Upon arrival, she finds a group of detectives waiting for her. Their gazes are serious, evaluating her attentively as they ask her to take a seat. Without preamble, they begin to question her about her relationship with Xiao Di, asking if they were close friends. The tension in the air is palpable, but to everyone's surprise, Chen Nian denies any close connection with her. With a firm voice, she assures that she only covered her face because she couldn't bear to see how others were taking photos, reducing a tragic moment to a mere morbid spectacle. The detectives exchange doubtful glances. Her response seems too cold, too calculated. But without evidence to contradict her, they end up letting her go. As she leaves the office, she feels the weight of their gazes following her, as if they were trying to decipher what she is really hiding behind her apparent indifference. Back in the classroom, the air seems denser, more hostile. As she approaches her desk, her stomach churns at the sight of what awaits her. Red ink spread over her chair, a cruelly familiar tactic. Xiao Di was also a victim of this before her death. And now, the cycle of harassment of the woman repeats. The memory hits her hard. Xiao Di had found her seat covered in ink weeks ago. The mockery hidden behind the gesture was evident, but instead of confronting it, she had decided to remain silent. With no other choice, she sat on the red liquid, staining her clothes, allowing the muffled laughter of her classmates to fill the room. Chen Nian saw it all. Everyone saw it, and like the rest, she remained silent, but this time she doesn't plan to do the same. When the moment comes to sit down, she remains still. Her classmates watch with anticipation, expecting her to react like Xiao Di, to give in to the humiliation without a word. But instead, Chen Nian refuses to do so. She doesn't want to dirty her uniform. She is not willing to follow the same path. The teacher, noticing the tension in the classroom, approaches with a frown. Upon seeing the spilled ink, his expression hardens. Without hesitation, he demands an explanation. Chen Nian remains calm and explains what happened. Her voice does not tremble, but she does not directly accuse anyone either. The teacher, visibly upset, reprimands the students. His voice resonates firmly as he reminds them that they are wasting time on nonsense instead of focusing on their studies. Then he turns his attention to Chen Nian. With a calmer tone but no less authoritative, he tells her that if she is being bullied, she must speak up, she must report it, but she refuses. The entire classroom watches her in silence. The teacher insists, this time in private, trying to get her to talk away from the pressure of her classmates, but Chen Nian holds her ground. Keeping silent is her only means of survival. That night, as the city's hustle and bustle fades away, Chen Nian returns home. But her home is not a refuge. It is a space where the weight of reality is just as crushing as it is at school. Her family has their own problems, concerns that consume them, leaving them with no space or energy to deal with hers. It is then that it becomes clear, Chen Nian is completely alone. She cannot rely on her family, she cannot trust the teachers, and speaking up would only make everything worse. In a world where the strongest survive, she must find her own way to endure. And although fear surrounds her, she decides to move forward in silence, bearing the weight of her own demons. The next day, in the school cafeteria, Wei Lai, the leader of the group of bullies, approaches Chen Nian with a smile that conveys not friendliness but a veiled threat. She leans towards her and in a casual yet authoritative tone demands help to pass the exams. It is not a request but an order in disguise, as a favor. Chen Nian observes her in silence. Wei Lai's presence is suffocating, but her response is firm. She refuses. The atmosphere around them instantly becomes tense. Wei Lai's smile fades and is replaced by a cold look. Without losing her composure, she takes out her phone and starts taking pictures of her. She does it slowly, deliberately, making sure Chen Nian understands what it means. It's the same method they used with Hu Xiaodi to humiliate her, to watch her, to reduce her to an object they can dispose of at will. At that moment, the truth becomes undeniable. Wei Lai and her group not only harassed Hu Xiaodi, they destroyed her. For months, they relentlessly harassed her, weakening her little by little until she had no way out. Chen Nian knows it, she has always known it, but fear consumes her, a paralyzing fear that prevents her from doing what she should, reporting to the police, telling the truth, but she doesn't do it. The harassment soon intensifies. Wei Lai and her group have found a new target and have no intention of stopping. When Chen Nian leaves school that afternoon, she feels the threat before she sees it. Footsteps behind her, barely audible whispers, the pressure of eyes piercing her back. She doesn't need to turn around to know what's coming. There is no escape. Suddenly, they surround her. Wei Lai smiles, but her eyes reflect pure cruelty. Without warning, they push her forcefully. Chen Nian stumbles and falls to the ground, but she doesn't have time to react before the kicks start. Kicks to the ribs. Begin. Hair pulling. Stifled laughter. It's punishment for having talked to the detectives, for not giving in, for not submitting. When they finally leave her, her body aches. But more than the physical pain, it's the helplessness that consumes her. Lying on the street, she feels the dampness of the asphalt sticking to her skin. Her aggressors walk away, satisfied, leaving behind the echo of her humiliation. But Chen Nian does not cry. She doesn't scream. Without saying a word, she gets up. Her uniform is dirty, her hair disheveled, but her expression remains the same, cold, restrained. She will not give them the pleasure of seeing her broken. She returns home in silence, carrying the weight of a battle she never asked to fight. Upon opening the door, the stench of cigarettes and stale food greets her as always. Inside, her mother is sitting at the table surrounded by boxes of illegal products she sells to survive. She barely looks up when Chen Nian enters. Her mother is barely present in her life, too busy trying to dodge creditors and making empty promises about a better future. "I do everything for us," she repeats, over and over, as if those words could justify the abandonment. This time is no different. With a smile that tries to seem encouraging, she assures her that soon things will change, that one day they will buy a new house and be able to live without fear. But Chen Nian doesn't listen, because she knows that promises mean nothing. There is no refuge for someone like her, neither at school nor at home. The next morning, her mother leaves without saying goodbye. Chen Nian, accustomed to her absence, suppresses any emotion and immerses herself in her routine with the same indifference as always. School remains a hostile place, but she has learned to navigate that environment without letting the aggressions break her down. However, that afternoon, upon returning home, a scene catches her attention. In a secluded alley, a group of thugs is brutally beating a young man. Fists fall violently on his body while the mocking laughter of his attackers echoes in the air. Chen stops and, without thinking too much, tries to call the police but doesn't get far. One of the thugs spots her and quickly snatches the phone from her hands. Before she can react, another one pushes her, also taking her money. The situation takes an even crueler turn when they force her to bend down and kiss the boy, whom they have been beating, reducing her intervention to a public humiliation. The young man on the ground, covered in bruises and blood, says nothing, but his eyes, dark and sharp, reflect a latent fury. His name is Xiaobei, a juvenile delinquent known for his troublesome reputation. When the attackers finally walk away satisfied with their show, Chen Yan watches as Xiaobei slowly gets up. His breathing is heavy, his body bruised, but his spirit is not broken. With a murderous look, he lunges at the gang leader and delivers a sharp blow to his jaw. The impact is enough to destabilize him, and without wasting time, Xiaobei chases him until he and his friends flee. After his fierce retaliation, Xiaobei turns to Chen Yan. His eyes scan her intensely, as if trying to decipher her intentions. But he doesn't say a word, he simply walks away. The next day, fate crosses their paths again. This time, Xiaobei approaches her without aggression. In a more relaxed tone, he thanks her for trying to help him the previous night and asks how much money was stolen from her. She responds without much emotion, 50 wen. He nods, and as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he offers to fix her phone as compensation. Chen Nian, incredulous, accompanies him to a small repair shop. Xiaobei doesn't have money to pay for the repair, but the shop owner, an old acquaintance, allows him to use his tools. She watches silently as Xiaobei works with precision, dismantling the device with an ease that surprises her. She can't help but ask him where he learned to do that. He shrugs and responds naturally that he has worked with many stolen parts. The answer catches her off guard, but she doesn't judge him. In this world, everyone survives as best they can. Still feeling indebted for what happened, Xiaobei makes her an unexpected proposal to become her bodyguard in exchange for money. Chen Yan immediately rejects it. Coldly, she reminds him that the previous night he couldn't even defend himself. Xiaobei remains unfazed, smiles with a certain arrogance, and responds that no matter how much they beat him, he always gets revenge. It's not about avoiding pain, but about making sure others pay for it. However, Chen Nian is not interested in that kind of logic. Keeping her distance, she firmly tells him that she will soon enter the best university in the country and that her life will be completely different from his. She doesn't want to get involved with someone like him. Xiaobei watches her calmly, and instead of feeling offended, he simply responds with a bluntness that leaves her speechless. It doesn't matter, in this world, if you're not the one mistreating others, sooner or later you become the victim. The words resonate in her mind long after they part ways. When Chen Nian returns home that night, she discovers that Xiaobei has silently followed her, escorting her, as if he has already decided that his proposal still stands, whether she likes it or not. However, his presence does not go unnoticed. A pair of police officers patrolling the area intercept him immediately, questioning him for his suspicious appearance. Xiaobei, accustomed to this type of encounter, responds with indifference, allowing the officers to lose interest and move on. Beyond that distraction, he accompanies her to the door of her home. From the entrance, he watches as Chen Yan finds a series of photos stuck on the wall of her building. They are images of her mother, deliberately left by her bullies. Without saying a word, she begins to tear them down, one by one. Xiaobei watches her in silence. He doesn't offer help, but he doesn't leave either. For the first time in a long time, Chen Nian is not completely alone. Despite everything, Xiaobei's presence becomes more than a whim. It is a necessity. The school reaches even more cruel levels, surpassing any limit that Chen Nian thought would exist. This time, it's not just taunts or physical aggression. Now rumors about her personal life begin to spread like poison. One by one, her classmates discover the truth about her family. Malicious whispers fill the hallways. Stifled laughter. They follow her wherever she goes. She is not just the weird girl who protected Hu Xiaodi's body, or the one who became the new target of Weilai and her group. Now she is also the daughter of a swindler. The looks of disdain multiply. Every conversation stops when she passes by. Every word she hears is another stab in a wound that keeps reopening. She tries to endure. She tells herself that none of this matters, that it will all pass. But the truth is she can't take it anymore. Isolated in a corner of the school, away from curious glances, she breaks down, crying. No matter how hard she tries to hold it back, the tears fall uncontrollably. She had never felt so alone. Exhaustion consumes her as she returns home with her head down, her steps slow and heavy. But when she reaches the main street, the sound of an engine pulls her out of her reverie. Xiaobei approaches on his motorcycle and watches her silently. He doesn't ask anything. At first, he just studies her intently as if he could read on her face everything she doesn't dare to say. Without thinking too much, Chen Nian asks him to take her far away, anywhere, away from her life. Xiaobei doesn't hesitate and accelerates. The motorcycle takes them away from the familiar streets, leading her to an uncertain destination. When they finally stop, they are under a bridge, in front of an improvised shack made of wood and metal. It's Xiaobei's home, a tiny space, barely protected from the cold, where he lives alone with no one to ask what time he arrives or to worry about his well-being. He waits for her to say something, but the silence stretches on too long. In the end, he decides to ask her what happened to her. Chen Nian averts her gaze and avoids answering. She doesn't want to talk. She doesn't want to share her misery with anyone. Not receiving a response, Xiaobei changes his approach and with a light, almost teasing tone, asks if the reason she agreed to let him walk her home the other night was because she feels something for him. But she is not in the mood for jokes. With coldness, she puts him in his place, making it clear that she is not interested in his games. Xiaobei, not too bothered, raises his hands in a gesture of surrender and assures her that he has no ulterior motives with her. Even so, the tension between them does not disappear. Chen Nian maintains her distant attitude and in a burst of frustration calls him a lazy person without manners, someone without aspirations or future. Her words hurt more than she expected. Xiaobei becomes furious, but instead of reacting, he simply watches her with a hard gaze. Despite the anger in his eyes, he says nothing. He doesn't try to stop her when she walks away, leaving the bridge and the feeling that, even in the midst of despair, she still doesn't allow anyone to get too close. The next day, the rumors continue to spread through the school like an unstoppable plague. Now, no one wants to be near Chen Nian. Her classmates deliberately avoid her, ignoring her in group activities. During physical education class, her isolation becomes even more evident when, at the moment of forming teams, none of the students choose her. Weilai and her friends take the opportunity to make her the target of their mockery. During the volleyball game, the aggression is disguised as play. At first, they throw the ball forcefully in her direction, laughing every time she tries to dodge it. But soon, they become more insistent, more brutal. The ball hits her body again and again until one final blow completely destabilizes her and makes her fall down the stairs. The impact is hard, but luckily she doesn't suffer any serious injuries. While she rests in the infirmary, her body aching and her mind still trapped in humiliation, a classmate approaches her with indifference. In a nonchalant tone, he tells her that there's not much time left until university, that they just have to endure a few more months before leaving school and everything that happens there behind. Then, without the slightest remorse, he mentions Hu Xiaodie, claiming she wasn't strong enough, that she didn't know how to endure it. The words pierce like needles. Chen Nian feels the air escape from her chest. Then, almost without thinking, with a thread of a trembling voice, she dares to ask what would happen if she couldn't endure it either. The silence she receives in response is colder than any mockery. Her companion only watches her with a blank expression before leaving, as if her concern didn't matter, as if surviving were a simple choice. But the worst is not over. In the solitude of the infirmary, when exhaustion overcomes her and she closes her eyes, the image of Hu Xiaodie appears in her mind. Not as a kind memory, but as an accusing specter. Her gaze reflects an unfathomable sadness, while her voice, cold and distant, echoes in Chen Nian's mind, reproaching her for not having done anything to help her. She reminds her that she saw what was happening and still did not intervene. Guilt tangles in her chest, suffocating her. Tired of the harassment, the loneliness, the constant fear, Chen Nian finally makes a decision. She goes to the police and files a formal complaint. She recounts every act of violence, every humiliation, every blow disguised as an accident. Inspector Shengye listens to her attentively. His gaze is serious, but his voice remains neutral as he begins the investigation. He interrogates Weilai and her group, but they deny any responsibility. With calculated cynicism, they divert the conversation and claim that Wu Xiaodi had personal problems, insinuating that her death had nothing to do with the harassment. Without sufficient evidence, the police find themselves limited in their actions. However, the school decides to take action and suspends Weilai and her friends for a year. But this does not put an end to the cycle of violence. The news of the suspension is not well received by the parents of those involved. One of them, furious, shows up at the school to plead for his daughter to be reinstated. When rejected, his desperation turns into anger. Unable to contain himself, he brutally beats his own daughter in front of the teachers and administrative staff. The sound of the blows echoes through the hallways, revealing an undeniable truth. The bullies are nothing more than another cog in a system of suffering and violence that repeats itself. Over and over again. The abuse doesn't start at school, it comes from a home where fear and brutality have been normalized. Chen Nian sees it clearly for the first time. There are no victims and perpetrators, only people trapped in a cycle that no one knows how to stop. Even the teacher ends up being collateral damage. Although he congratulates Chen Nian for her bravery, his voice lacks enthusiasm. The reality is inescapable. He has been relieved of his position. With resignation, he warns her that in situations like this, things can get worse before they get better. He doesn't offer a solution, just a discouraging certainty. In the end, it all comes down to enduring, to holding on until time does its part. On the way home, Detective Sheng Ye runs into her and offers her a ride. Chen Nian accepts. On the way, the atmosphere inside the car is heavy, laden with truths that neither of them dares to say out loud. Finally, it is she who breaks the silence with a firm voice but without emotion. She tells him that she knows the truth. She knows that everyone knows who was responsible for the death of Hak Xiaodi. But she also understands that no one will do anything. The situation is too complicated, the system too rigid, justice too unattainable. The detective does not try to contradict her, he just nods wearily, accepting the bitter reality. There is not enough evidence, no witnesses willing to speak. And worst of all, Wei Lai has parents who protect her fiercely, convinced that she is innocent. As long as they are on her side, the system will never be able to touch her. With a mix of helplessness and pragmatism, Sheng Ye advises her to focus on her studies. He tells her that soon everything will be over, as if the simple act of graduating could erase everything that happened, but his words offer no comfort. They do not change the fact that the problem continues to grow, that fear still haunts her, and that violence does not disappear just because someone decides to look the other way. At home, Chen Nian manages to communicate with her mother, although the call does not provide the comfort she expects. The woman is not only still hiding from her creditors, but now she faces another even more serious problem. The beauty products she sells have caused allergic reactions in some customers, which has led to threats against her. Through the line, Chen Nian perceives the weariness in her mother's voice, fear disguised as resignation. There is not much she can do about it. She accepts that for a while she will be completely alone. However, she tries to comfort her, assuring her that they must endure, that sooner or later everything will get better, even though deep down she is not even sure she believes it. For a moment, life at school seems to return to normal with the arrival of a new teacher, but the truth is just an illusion. The suspension of Wei Lai and her group has only made things worse. Deprived of the school's protection and consumed by the anger of having been punished, the bullies no longer have any restraints and are now willing to take the violence to a much more dangerous level. That night, Chen Nian encounters them at the entrance of her house. They haven't come with taunts or shoves. This time they brought a cage full of rats and hold it with a threatening intent, enjoying the terror reflected on her face. But that's not all. One of them pulls out a pocket knife, the blade glinting under the dim streetlight. Fear paralyzes her for a moment, but as panic fully hits her, her survival instinct takes over and she runs. Desperate, Chen Nian flees with all her strength, hearing the shouts and laughter of her attackers behind her. She manages to escape, but just barely. Her breathing is erratic, her body trembles, and the feeling of danger still surrounds her. On an impulse, she dials Detective Sheng Ye's number, but when he answers, her voice breaks her, and doubt consumes her. She knows that reporting it won't change anything, that police protection is fleeting and the consequences could be worse. With a lump in her throat, she lies. She tells him she dialed his number by mistake before hanging up. With no other option, she keeps running until she finds shelter. In the only place she has left, Xiao Bei's house. That night, she begs him to help her. Even though she has nothing to offer in return, she asks him to protect her while she studies for her exam. Since then, Xiao Bei accompanies her every day, escorting her from school to home. His presence deters the bullies from attacking her, but rumors soon spread, insinuating that she uses men to protect her. The bond between them strengthens over time, but everything changes when Xiao Bei is detained by the police to be part of a lineup. Without his protection, Chen Nian is left vulnerable. That same afternoon, Wei Lai and her group catch her. Completely, they cut her hair and strip her of her clothes, recording everything on video. When Xiao Bei is released, he returns home and finds her badly injured. Without hesitation, he helps her shave her head completely and shaves his own in solidarity. Days later, the university entrance exam arrives, but a storm causes a landslide that uncovers Wei Lai's corpse. The police start an investigation, and upon discovering the recording of the attack, they identify Chen Nian as a suspect. While they interrogate her, Xiaobei finds her and they flee together. He proposes a plan to her. If he takes the blame for the murder, she will be able to continue with her life. Although she hesitates, she agrees and he pretends to attack her so that the police will arrest him as the sole culprit. But the truth is different. Wei Lai had begged Chen Nian not to report the video, and when she pushed her in a fit of desperation, the aggressor fell down the stairs and died. The police interrogate Chen Nian and Xiaobei, who pretend not to know each other. But when Detective Sheng tells Chen Nian that Xiaobei has been sentenced to death, she confesses the truth. Finally, both receive a reduced sentence and are imprisoned. Years later, Chen Nian becomes a teacher. One day, she notices a distressed child and decides to accompany him home. In the distance, without her noticing, Xiaobei follows her closely. On the screen, messages are displayed about the new government measures to combat school bullying, reminding of the importance of protecting the youth. Better Days is not just a story about school bullying or the difficulties faced by those who are marginalized, but also about resilience, sacrifice, and the consequences of a system that often fails those who need it most. Throughout this story, Chen Nian and Xiaobei show us that in a world where injustice seems inevitable, even the weakest can find a way to move forward, even if the cost is too high. The film leaves a clear message. The responsibility to protect young people does not rest solely on them, but on the entire society. Every action, every decision, and every indifference can make a difference in someone's life. If you like the summary, don't forget to support the channel with a like and share your opinion in the comments. See you in the next video with another story you can't miss.